morning.
So everybody's speaking English, right?
Good morning, teacher.
Well, it's wonderful to see you again. This session is devoted to a discussion of violence, feminist approaches to the understanding of violence and to struggles against violence. I thought I would begin by explaining the title of the seminar, The Color of Violence. The color of violence is a concept that developed in connection with a conference that took place in the year 2000. The conference was called The Color of Violence, and it was inspired by the need to address a range of urgent issues related to violence in the lives of women of color. Eventually, an organization was created as a result of the conference. The name of the organization is INSIGHT, Women of Color Against Violence. And I'll talk a little bit about the development of the organization, but if you want to examine it further, there is a website. Actually, I don't think there's an information point on but for the website, yeah. Now, perhaps I'll begin by explaining why so many activists and scholars felt the need to develop a conversation on violence in the lives of women of color. The women's movement that emerged during the 60s, 67, 68, 69, was in large part, I'm trying to look at the translator to see whether he's finishing. So is it working? It's okay, good. So the women's movement, which was in those days called the Women's Liberation Movement, was in large part a response to two overarching issues that involved violence inflicted on women's bodies. The one issue was domestic violence. The second issue was rape and other forms of sexual abuse. Both domestic violence and sexual assault were at that time considered to be issues to be resolved privately. They were personal issues. And of course, the slogan of the women's movement, which we discussed yesterday, "The personal is political," emerged largely from an effort to politicize these two forms of violence inflicted on women's bodies. So the earliest demands revolved around what was considered to be a need to criminalize violence against women. That is to say, these forms of violence should be recognized as crimes to be dealt with by law enforcement and the courts. And this was perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of what was meant by the slogan, "The personal is political." And let me give you an example. Often in cases where women were being beaten by their partners, their husbands, their boyfriends, the police would be called. The response of the police was that this is a domestic issue. This is a private issue. This is between the man and the woman. And so it's understandable that some of the first demands called for the intervention of the state into what had previously been considered personal, private problems. Now, a similar approach was taken with respect to sexual assault, with respect to rape. Oftentimes, when cases involving rape were dealt with by the court system, it was the woman who was considered the responsible party. Judges would respond by saying that her skirt was too short. Or she came on to the man who was her rapist. And you're all familiar with these kinds of responses, right? And so in order to address these dilemmas, demands from the women's movement called for the criminalization of sexual assault. Now, why were so few black women involved in these campaigns early on? Why were black women reluctant to embrace a movement that called for more police intervention? I think you know the answer. And black feminists during that period, the late 60s, the early 70s, often made the argument that we needed a far more complicated analysis of violence. As a matter of fact, with respect to rape and sexual assault, we pointed out that the tradition that emerged from slavery gave the slave master the prerogative to inflict sexual violence on black women's bodies. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't so much a private or personal dynamic. As a matter of fact, it was an institutionalized dynamic of slavery. And then we also pointed out that the rape charge used against black men was often a critical aspect of racism. The vast numbers of black men who were lynched in the aftermath of slavery were often victims of the claim that they had raped a white woman. And so the racist use of the rape charge further complicated our understandings of sexual violence against women. Now, when the conference, The Color of Violence, took place in the year 2000, I actually gave the keynote address. And so I have a very brief excerpt from the talk that I gave at that conference. Okay. And I'm going to try to read it slowly. Okay. We need an analysis that furthers neither the conservative project of sequestering millions of men of color in accordance with the contemporary dictates of globalized capital and its prison industrial complex, nor the equally conservative project of abandoning poor women of color to a continuum of violence that extends from the sweatshops maquilas, through the prisons, to shelters, and into bedrooms at home. How do we develop analyses and organizing strategies against violence against women that acknowledge the race of gender and the gender of race? So, was that clear? I'm sorry, the sentence was really long. But the point that I was making at that conference was that we had to begin to think about approaches to violence that do not rely on criminalization, that do not invite the police and law enforcement to play even greater roles in our lives.